Welcome everyone to the discussion tonight. Given the strategic situation and Trump's attack on Iran, we thought the best thing would be to have a broader discussion tonight, since many of you might have thoughts and responses to it all. We've invited a special guest, Bruce Director. Bruce did the class on Saturday night, so he's kind of doing double duty. But he's been someone who worked with Mr. LaRouche in our strategic operations for over 50 years. And many of you may already know him. And if you don't, he's got brilliant insights and a good sense of some of the history. So it's going to be he'll be a helpful and positive contribution to the discussion tonight, no doubt. So I was going to just give a few opening remarks, and so was Bruce. We wanted to kind of give more time to discussions tonight than the opening remarks per se, because we probably think discussion at these kinds of points are useful for everyone involved. You get a sense of how different people are thinking. You get to hear responses to different ideas or questions. If people can, we want you to engage in dialogue and discussion. It's important that at least bring some kind of question for us, so that at least there can be some kind of dialogue. But it doesn't always have to end with a question mark. You can add context. You can give your thoughts and ideas. We want to hear that, but it's good to have at least some sense of what you want us to respond to. But we do want to hear from new people. You don't have to be used to this. You can kind of bring raw thoughts. You can bring just kind of your first emotional response if there's still a lack of clarity. Certainly, Barbara and Susan have both done really important videos on the question of what Trump is doing. What is Iran as a country? What is the context for this attack? And essentially a certain war that's now ongoing. So if you haven't seen that, certainly Barbara's went incredibly viral on X over the weekend. It was one of the dominating news trends on X, because in some sense, people were asking the question, what is going on? Why is this happening? So if you haven't seen those, maybe Tony or Keisha or someone can drop those into the chat box so people at least can access those after the discussion tonight. If you're watching this on YouTube, of course, please hit like and subscribe, follow our channel. Most importantly, sign up for the Promethean Action newsletter in the description so that you can join us on these calls on Monday nights. We do this live Monday every night at 6 o'clock Eastern. So in terms of just some of my opening remarks, then I'm going to bring Bruce in for his. Under any other presidency, all of the skepticism and concern and dread over a prolonged war or a regime change war in the Middle East. We've all lived this history for 20 years now. Many people have kind of grown up into this history. They have a sense that, the speculations or hypotheses that Israel is controlling Trump's policies, the neocons are now controlling him. He sold out to the Epstein class. It's all about the Epstein files. This is the Democrats. This is the mainstream media. It's a lot of the turncoats like Thomas Massie or Marjorie Taylor Greene. And you see in many cases, people just don't understand the dynamic. And they're kind of reacting. They're maybe looking for clickbaits. They're just wanting to push a certain kind of peace agenda because peace is always just the right thing. And a lot of people are shell-shocked from the long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Not just the wars, but what happened to our country during those period of wars. So it wasn't just the wars. I mean, of course, Iraq was perhaps the greatest strategic mistake in American history, but it wasn't like it was just the wars. It was the entire quality of leadership. It was a leadership, whether it was Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, and then, of course, Biden. If you look at all of these presidents, all of them were severe failures. Entirely, not just in foreign policy. Clinton didn't engage in a new war, but he certainly didn't prevent the wars that were building. He may have signed some agreements. Maybe he had better efforts than most, really, when you think of it, in terms of a foreign policy record. But there is no doubt that the Bush, Cheney, and Obama administrations were devastating across the board. I mean, between Bush and Cheney's pushing for wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, they let 9/11 happen. This is what Trump said at the famous South Carolina debate in early 2016. But it's the case that the national security establishment under Bush and Cheney failed totally. And then they moved aggressively to consolidate unconstitutional powers under the Patriot Act, pushed us into the Iraq War, largely under British direction, Tony Blair, the dodgy dossier, the same Lord Mandeville. Was it Mandeville? Malin? What's his name? Uh,
Mandeville?
say it again.
Mandeville? You talk about?
Not no the guy that's just been arrested on the Epstein files.
Oh, Mandelson.
Mandelson, yeah, it's kind of like Mandeville. Um, so he was directly involved in Blair's administration, and they were pushing hard for that Iraq War invasion. But it was also the fact that we had the WTO. We brought China in. NAFTA was on steroids. We lost most of our manufacturing. I mean, this massive acceleration took place under Bush and Cheney. The housing bubble, the bailouts. I mean, our nation was just getting wrecked. And then we brought in Obama with all the false promises. And the nation just spiraled out of control. And in the Middle East, Obama backed the very terrorist groups that we helped create in Iraq. Obama was now funding them in Syria. Al Qaeda, ISIS, the Muslim Brotherhood was brought to power in Egypt under Obama's reign. And so there was a kind of pro terrorist, pro caliphate, kind of so called under the idea of Arab Springs or colored revolutions in the Middle East. This entire region was being wrecked and destroyed. And then you have Trump. And Trump's first action when he came to power, in both cases, in both terms, but in the first term, he spoke at a major summit, I believe at the Organization of Islamic Countries, but it might have been a joint session with the Gulf Cooperation Council. But it was a number of 40, 50 Islamic nations from Indonesia and Pakistan into the Middle East and North Africa. And he wanted to end, he says, the United States essentially is ending this war with Islam that has been whipped up by Bush and Cheney. We are ending the intelligence community's support for terrorist networks. We're ending this idea of you guys are now serving some kind of globalist ideology of interest of the caliphate. And we're wanting to bring to bear kind of a new renaissance of massive economic development, trade, technology, city building in this region. And when you look at the region, the Middle East region is got far more potential in many ways than Europe does. Europe is so culturally disoriented and ideologically confused with no real leadership or direction. And that could change, but it's bad. I mean, it's so bad that Germany doesn't put salt on the sidewalks in the middle of winter because they think it's bad for the environment. And you've got all these people going into emergency rooms with broken bones and hips because they're falling on the ice. It's just a very, very bad state of mind. It's like a mini dark age. The Middle East shows this kind of prosperity. They kind of want to see a resurgence of nation states. They want to banish the impressions that much of the world has that these are backwards, terrorist-filled, barbaric territory on the planet. They want to kind of change that perspective. Trump knows it. A lot of Witkoff knows it. Kushner knows it. A lot of the people that have been doing business with some of these guys see that same potential, and they see the orientation. So Trump goes there in his first term. He did the same thing his second term, under certain different circumstances, but a same commitment. So what I see is somebody who fought and opposed the Iraq wars. I worked with this organization. I recognize the foresight of what Mr. LaRouche was saying about this Bush-Cheney regime, the failures of 9/11, that there's no way we should trust a regime to go and attack a country that had nothing to do with 9/11. But today I totally support what President Trump is doing. We have to change this orientation. President Trump said it in his speech on Sunday, that my concern is not for right now. He didn't do this because Iran poses a threat right now. He's well aware that Iran poses a threat long term. And what kind of threat? What do you mean by threat? Well, one, of course, it's a nuclear weapon potential. That's true. 60% weapons grade uranium or 60% high grade uranium is close to weapons grade. They're obviously not pursuing a nuclear weapon. The bigger question, though, is the kind of dynamic. What does it mean for Israel's policies, for their ability to drag us into further war in the future? What does it mean for the dynamics of some of these neocons who just are so caught up in a drive for more and more aggressive war? It continues to fuel their fires. And so you have a regime that is unwilling to engage, unwilling to have a dialogue. People say they were in negotiations, but Trump's not faking it. Trump will talk to anybody. If Trump thinks someone's genuine, like Kim Jong-un, he'll meet with them, shake their hand, walk into North Korea. After all the kinds of bluster and talk between them, Trump is totally willing to trust and open up and say, if we can get on the same page, that would be wonderful. And yet there was no commitment from the Iranian regime to do this. And the potential of leaving this down the road for another president later doesn't work well in my mind. J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio, whoever the next maybe president and successor to Trump may be, won't have the prestige or the political leverage or the overall kind of relationships that Trump has. But more than anything, when someone has the guts and courage, the boldness to take a risk, because I think he's doing this, regardless if any of us agree or not, I think we can demonstrate it, that Trump has the right vision of where the world needs to go, of sovereign nations, of a new trade agreement, of industrialization, space exploration, advancements of energy. Is everything perfect? Is everything all going in that direction? But is that the direction he's taking us? Absolutely. And so despite not having bipartisan support, far from it, doesn't even have the full support of the Republicans, though he has most of them. And he has some Democrats, but probably not most of them. He doesn't have the media. He doesn't have a bipartisan consensus. He's got Bolton and the neocons constantly nipping at his heels because he's not going to do the regime change the way he wants. He's not going to aggressively use Iran for war with Russia, which was ultimately the neocon game. It wasn't always just about Iran. Iran was really a branching point to escalate further in terms of the underbelly of Russia directly. And Trump has totally changed that entire perspective. So to have the boldness and risk, what is he risking? He's risking the midterm election, which would mean certain impeachment if he lost both chambers in the Congress. He's risking a broader war, the very thing he promised he would never do. He's risking economic chaos around the oil prices. All of these things that we see and might be fearful of, Trump saw them also. And he's personally accountable for it all, and yet he still took the risk. He made the move. And in some sense, if we can resolve this problem of a regime that will not collaborate, that ultimately would prefer to hang on to an anti-American sentiment, that American government is essentially illegitimate, which is what it communicates when you don't talk directly, and has been hostile and has been hostile in a number of different ways in the Middle East, then it's a question of, can this be pushed down, especially when the population of Iran is in upheaval? So I think the boldness and courage that Trump took is a sign of someone willing to lead, even if he knows many people are not necessarily going to back him initially. He knows he's got to make this work. And I think from that perspective, and how much this might change the global dynamic, how it might change the Middle East, the very crossroads of the world, the very cockpit of the kind of globalist empire approach to perpetual warfare, how this might stabilize that region and open up new potential relationships with the major nations, Russia, China, India, and the United States, is huge. So that's kind of, I think, a quick summary of my perspective. Bruce, I want to just give it to you and see what you have to say, and obviously take the time you need to kind of develop your thoughts. And then we'll take some questions and answers and see what other people are thinking. And I'll bring you in here.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Mike. I really appreciate your remarks. Like Mike, I am probably could characterize myself as generally anti-war. I oppose the Iraq War. I oppose the extended war in Afghanistan and the mess that Bush made. I oppose the Gulf War, which was provoked by the United States. I've opposed U.S. involvement in the Ukraine war, and I could go on. And yet, this is a time when this is the first war actually in my lifetime that I can actually say that I think is the right move. I think Trump, as Mike said, Trump did everything he could to try and avoid this war, but this became impossible, largely, in my view, because the British and the globalists wanted to prevent any negotiated settlement. And let me just give a little bit of history. I've seen some quotes and some things in the chat that have already pointed to this, but that I worked with Lyndon LaRouche all the way back from 1973 onward. And that was shortly after the U.S. Nixon had taken the dollar off the gold standard. And at that point, what was initiated was a global policy of what the Council on Foreign Relations called controlled disintegration. That was a deindustrialization of the world. And Brzezinski came in later with Carter and implemented this policy called the Arc of Crisis, which was to use Islamic fundamentalism as a battering ram against the Soviet Union. This, of course, accelerated in the period after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. But, and we all know that story and how it actually led to the rise of ISIS and Islamic fundamentalism. But this goes all the way back by the British to the turn of the century, 19th to the 20th century, when the British fleet shifted from coal to oil, and the Middle East became a major focal point for them. And they created the Muslim Brotherhood and have been committed to using Islamic fundamentalism as a way to keep the region in constant turmoil so that they could maintain imperial control. And that policy has continued all the way through to this day. And that much to the detriment of the United States. Now, back in the 70s, the U.S. was very vulnerable to this because we were not self-sufficient in oil. And at the same time, we had environmentalist movement that was taking down nuclear power, and the U.S. was quite vulnerable to this. And for those of you who are old enough, you probably remember the gas lines and the oil shortages of the 70s. And in the middle of this, you had the overthrow of the Shah and the installation of Khomeini, who led the creation of the Islamic Republic. This was done with the complete support of the British and the acquiescence of the Carter administration and Brzezinski, who believed that an Islamic fundamentalist regime in Iran would be useful for their geopolitical reasons to go against the Soviet Union, and also feed into this policy of controlled disintegration, largely through control of oil. Now, we don't have to go through the history of the last 50 years to see how that played out, but it morphed into what we now call globalism. And every single president, including Reagan, basically acquiesced to this policy, this British policy. If you remember the famous Iran-Contra scandal, where deals were made with the mullahs in Iran to sell weapons to the Contras, and in exchange the U.S. would provide support for the Iranian regime. This regime has been bailed out by the British and with the acquiescence of the U.S. Repeatedly. And Trump is right. The people of Iran are very energetic, very nationalistic, and very committed to progress, but they have been captured by basically a fascist Islamo-fascist regime, which has, as Trump has said, been a major source of instability throughout the world. Trump promised in 2015, when he was first running, that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and the deal that Obama, he pledged to dismantle the deal that Obama made and do something to stop the instability of that Iran posed in the world. And in his first term, he did everything he could to try and get around that. And he was able to create the Abraham Accords. But the Islamic Republic, the leadership there, has been the main source of instability in the Middle East. LaRouche once gave a lecture at trying to remember an institute in the Middle East, in an Arab country, in which he said you have to understand the Middle East, you have to look at it from 10 miles up and 10,000 years backward in time. And you see that it's the crossroads between Africa, Europe, and Asia. And it's been a center of crossroads of civilization for all that time, which is why it's an area that's of constant concern. So for my fellow MAGA supporters who seem to have an inability to change their thinking and a desperate need to stick to some fixed ideas, I say you really need to think through, and you really need to think in a different way. Trump did not launch this war because the Israelis made him do it or the neocons made him do it. The fact that the Israelis are participating in these actions is Israel's interest, but this is an America first action Trump has taken, because it is in America's interest right now to reorganize the global strategic situation around the idea of the American century. This is the policy that Franklin Roosevelt had and argued with Winston Churchill about. At the end of World War II, while the war was still going on, Roosevelt said to Churchill, "We're not fighting this war to defend the British, French, Portuguese, and Dutch empires and all your European empires. Your imperial system caused this war, and it caused World War I, and it's caused all these wars. The rest of the 20th century is going to be the American century, where we're going to use the methods of economic development that we've been using in the United States, which have enabled us to lead the fight against fascism, and we're going to use that to industrialize the colonies, your former colonies." And Roosevelt died, and that policy was never implemented. And Trump and every president since Roosevelt has not only failed to implement that policy, but has gone along with the British policy. Some tried to resist this, like Reagan to some degree with his strategic defense initiative, but they've done nothing. They backed down. When it came time to actually take a decisive action, they backed down. Trump has not done that. Trump is the only president we've had since Roosevelt who was willing to stand up for the United States and say that the rest of the world has to redefine itself around with the U.S. leadership leading the world towards economic development. And if you think about what Trump has done in this last year, he's reasserted this in global strategic relations as represented by his speech at Davos, by his actions in taking on the Europeans, and the statements by Vance and Rubio and so forth, and most importantly, his economic policy based on tariffs, where he said we're no longer going to be taken advantage of, and we're going to create a new set of economic relationships in which are mutually beneficial for our trading partners and us. And we're not going to outsource U.S. policy to some coalition of the willing, some group of globalists or international bodies. Other presidents have complained about this, but they've all gone along with it. You know, George Bush said it over and over again. We won't ask for a permission slip from the United Nations to do what's in the interest of the United States. And then his policy was completely controlled by the British and the United Nations and the globalists. And Trump is the first president we've ever had who stood up for that. Now, I totally agree with Mike that, you know, he wanted not to have this war, but it was clear that it was coming to a head, and either he cleans this thing up or it will fester and destroy everything he's trying to do in terms of reasserting American prosperity over the rest of his term, which is only 3 years now. And he's got to get a lot done, and this has to be done now. It was a present danger. You could say there wasn't an imminent threat, but how imminent does a threat have to be? You know, 2 months imminent, 5 months imminent, a year imminent. I mean, you either take action when you have to, or it doesn't happen. Now, it's obvious that this is a war. It's a nonlinear situation. All kinds of risks can happen in a war. Trump was asked that even the other day, you know, before he launched the attacks, saying, do you think that there's a risk that this could lead to a forever war? And he said, well, you never know. In war, you don't know, but you have to take risks. And that's one of the very, in a certain sense, ironically, a sort of comforting factor here, because Trump is a president who's willing to take risks, but he's not taking reckless risks. He's taking very calculated risks. And one of the things that seems to be clear is that the capability of the United States military and intelligence services are more than what is generally known by the population. Now, we are at a certain disadvantage because we don't have the kind of inside knowledge that the president and his team knows. And neither do all those people who are tweeting on X and putting out statements with complete sense of definitiveness about this intelligence thing and that intelligence thing and this history and this hypothesis about what's going on. And so I think we should refrain from making definitive statements that are completely without any foundation. But we do know one thing, and I'm not, is that we have a president who has demonstrated his leadership and his capability and his commitment to what he said, making America great again and making life better for all people around the world. He wants them to do well. And I think he deserves the trust and backing of the American people right now. And that's why, even though I opposed every single war that has happened in the last 50 years, I can 100% support what President Trump is doing right now. As I said, this is war. The unexpected things can happen, including very bad things. I'm not saying this is going to be a piece of cake. I'm not saying mission accomplished. But what I am saying is that this is a just war and a just fight. And we have a leadership that sees it that way. And if that leadership is successful, we will come out of this in a much better place than the world is in right now.